The Shy Ranch Worker and the Charming Cowboy. A beautiful ranch love story, cowboy secrets. He was crying. That was the first thing Mason Holt noticed when he stepped out of the barn that Tuesday morning, a young man sitting alone on the fence post at the edge of the south pasture, shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller, one hand pressed flat against his chest, as if he could hold something broken together from the outside. The sun had barely cracked the horizon. The horses were still sleeping. And this stranger, this boy Mason had never seen before in his life, was sitting on his family's property in the blue-gray light of early morning, quietly falling apart. Mason stopped walking. He stood there with a coffee mug in his hand, steam rising in the cold air, and he watched. He wasn't eavesdropping. He wasn't being cruel. He just didn't know what to do, because in all his 24 years of living on Sundown Ranch, all his years of watching sunrises and mending fences and working cattle and sleeping under more stars than most people ever see in a lifetime, he had never once seen someone cry like that. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just quietly, the way a person does when they've been crying for so long that their body has forgotten how to do it any other way. The young man reached up and wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. He sniffed once. He straightened his back. And then he looked up at the sky, that wide, endless West Texas sky, and he took the longest, deepest breath Mason had ever witnessed another human being take, like he was drinking the air, like he was deciding something. Mason cleared his throat. The young man spun around so fast he nearly fell off the fence. His boots scrambled against the wood, and his eyes, the color of deep river water, greenish-gray and startled, locked onto Mason with a look that was half fear and half pure, scorching embarrassment. His face went red in an instant. His jaw tightened. And Mason, who was not always the most thoughtful person in a delicate situation, said the first thing that came into his head. "You're either our new ranch hand or the world's saddest trespasser." Eli Carter was not having the best morning of his life. That much was obvious. He had arrived the night before, long after dark, having driven his dented, dust-covered pickup truck from a town 300 miles east, where he had spent the last 18 months working a cattle operation that went bankrupt without warning. The owner had given him 2 weeks' notice and a handshake and told him he was sorry. Eli had packed everything he owned into one duffel bag and a cardboard box and driven until he couldn't anymore. He had pulled into Sundown Ranch at 10:30 at night, been shown to the small bunkhouse room by a tired woman named Dottie who worked in the main house kitchen, and he had lain awake in that narrow bed for hours listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else's land. He wasn't crying about the job, or not just about the job. He was crying because he was 22 years old and he had been starting over his entire life, and some mornings the weight of that fact pressed down on a person's chest like a stone. He was crying because the fence post he had chosen to sit on felt solid and real in a world that had never felt particularly solid to him. He was crying because it was 5:30 in the morning and nobody was watching, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a person got 5 minutes to feel everything before they had to get back up and pretend they were fine. He had not counted on a tall, broad-shouldered cowboy with dark hair and a coffee mug, and the most annoyingly easy smile he had ever seen appearing out of the barn like a character from a movie. "I'm Eli Carter," he said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "I start today. I was told to report to the foreman at 6. "That's me," Mason said, walking toward him with an outstretched hand. "Mason Holt. My father owns this place. I basically run it." He said this without any particular pride, just matter of fact, the way someone states something that has simply always been true. His handshake was firm. His palm was rough with work. His eyes, dark brown and warm as firelight, didn't look away when Eli met them, which made Eli want to look away immediately. He didn't. He forced himself not to. "Good to meet you," Eli said. "Likewise." Mason tilted his head slightly, and there was something in his expression, not pity, not condescension, just a quiet kind of seeing, that made Eli's chest tighten for a completely different reason than it had been tight 5 minutes ago. "You want some coffee before we start? Dottie makes it strong enough to wake the dead." Eli almost said no. He almost said he was fine, that he was ready to work, that he didn't need anything. He had been saying those words his entire life, "I'm fine, I'm ready, I don't need anything," and they sat in his throat like smooth, flat stones he could pull out whenever the situation required. But the morning was cold, and the coffee smelled good, and this man was looking at him like his answer actually mattered. "Yeah," Eli said, "I could use some coffee." The ranch was more beautiful than anything Eli had expected. Sundown Ranch spread across 1,200 acres of rolling West Texas hill country, the land broken up by ancient cedar and live oak, limestone outcroppings, 2 seasonal creeks, and 1 deep swimming hole that Mason mentioned casually in the first hour of their tour as if it were nothing remarkable. The main house was a sprawling stone and timber structure that looked like it had grown out of the earth rather than been built on it. The barns were enormous and impeccably maintained. The pastures were divided by miles of cedar post fencing, some of it obviously new, some of it so old the wood had turned silver gray. There were 230 head of cattle, 17 horses, a pack of 4 working border collies, and 1 ancient, arthritic donkey named Gerald, who, according to Mason, had been on the property since before Mason was born, and who bit anyone who tried to move him from his preferred spot near the south barn door. "He bit my father twice last spring," Mason said, and he said it with the fond exasperation of someone describing a maddening but beloved family member. "My father is a man who has been thrown by horses, gored by a yearling bull, and struck by lightning, actual lightning. You can see the scar on his arm, and the one thing that makes him genuinely afraid is a 15-year-old donkey." Eli looked over at Gerald, who stood motionless in the shadow of the barn door with the dignified immovability of a creature that has made a firm decision about its place in the world and intends to defend it. "I like him," Eli said quietly. Mason laughed. It was a sudden, unguarded sound, like something that surprised him as much as it surprised Eli. "Of course you do," he said. "Gerald always finds his people." They walked the fence line for the better part of that first morning. Mason talked steadily about the operation, the cattle rotation schedule, the quirks of the land, where the creek flooded in heavy rain, which pasture gate had a sticky latch that would come back off its hinges if you didn't lift it just right when you closed it. He pointed out the hawk's nest in the tall cedar at the east corner of the property, the spot along the limestone ridge where you could see clear to the highway on a bright day, the section of the south fence that he'd rebuilt himself last summer after a storm took down 4 posts. Eli listened. He was a good listener. It was perhaps the thing he was best at in the world, and he filed everything away with a quiet, careful thoroughness that was simply how his mind worked. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't fill silences, but he was paying attention in a way that was total and complete, and after about an hour Mason seemed to notice this, because he paused in the middle of a sentence about the hay storage schedule and looked at Eli with a slightly surprised expression. "You actually hear everything I'm saying, don't you?" Mason said. "Yes," Eli said. "Most new guys tune out after the first 20 minutes. I'm not most new guys." Mason held his gaze for a moment, just a moment, not long enough for Eli to classify it as anything significant, just long enough for him to notice it was happening, and then nodded slowly. "No," he said, "I don't think you are." The first week was work, pure, exhausting, satisfying work. Eli threw himself into it the way he always threw himself into work, completely, methodically, without complaint. He was up before 5 every morning, a habit ingrained from years of ranching in places where the day started whether you were ready or not. He ate breakfast with the other 3 ranch hands, a middle-aged man named Cliff who spoke in short sentences and possessed an almost supernatural ability to fix broken machinery, a 20-year-old kid named Rooster whose real name was Roberto but who answered to nothing else, and a quiet, weathered man called T-Bone who had been on Sundown Ranch for 11 years and who regarded all newcomers with a prolonged, assessing silence that Eli suspected was his version of a welcome. They were decent men. They gave him space. They didn't ask about his past, which was either ranch hand courtesy or disinterest, and Eli was grateful either way. Mason worked alongside them most days, which was not the arrangement Eli had expected. He had assumed the owner's son would be more managerial, giving directions, checking in periodically, disappearing to do paperwork. But Mason Holt was the kind of man who could not watch work being done without picking up a tool and joining in. He was in the pasture with them at first light, in the barn at the end of the day, on the fence line during the long hot afternoons when the sun pressed down like a weight and the cicadas were so loud they filled the whole world with sound. He worked harder than anyone. He was also, and Eli noticed this with the careful, slightly reluctant attention he gave to most things, consistently, almost effortlessly kind. Not kind in an obvious, performative way, just kind in the way that some people simply are, the kind that costs them nothing because it is the default state of their character. He remembered everyone's preferences. He noticed when T-Bone's back was bothering him and rearranged the day's tasks without making a thing of it. He brought cold water to the fence line without being asked. He had a particular way of listening to people that made them feel like whatever they were saying was worth his full attention, and he had a laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep and uncomplicated and real. Eli found himself watching him, studying him almost, the way he moved around the ranch with an ease that was born of absolute belonging, the way he spoke to the horses, low and steady, his hands always gentle, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, the way he pushed his hat back when he found something genuinely funny. Eli watched all of this with a careful, neutral expression on his face, and he told himself it was purely observational. He was good at reading people. He had learned it early as a survival skill in a childhood where reading the room had sometimes been the difference between a calm evening and a very bad one. That was all this was: observation, information, nothing more than that. He was aware, not entirely telling himself the truth. The first time they worked alone together was a Wednesday afternoon in Eli's second week. Mason asked him to help replace a damaged section of fence on the far east corner of the property, a full 2 miles from the main barn, accessible only by an unpaved track that wound through a stand of cedar so thick it felt like a different world entirely. They loaded the truck with posts and wire and tools and drove out in the early afternoon heat, the truck bouncing over the uneven ground, neither of them talking much. The radio played something old and country that Mason drummed his fingers on the steering wheel to, without seeming to notice, he was doing it. The work was physical and straightforward and took about 3 hours. They fell into a rhythm quickly, Eli digging, Mason positioning, both of them on the wire without needing to discuss who took which side. There was something Eli had always loved about working in sync with another person, the kind of wordless coordination that happened when two people were both paying close attention and neither of them was trying to lead. It was rare. Most people either talked too much or got in each other's way. Mason did neither. They worked until the sun started to soften and the shadows stretched long across the grass. When the last post was set and the last wire stretched and fastened, Mason straightened up and put his hands on the small of his back and looked at the repaired fence line with the uncomplicated satisfaction of someone admiring a thing they built. "Good work," he said, glancing sideways at Eli. "You too," Eli said. "You're fast, and you know how to handle wire. Most guys who haven't been doing it since they were 12 cut themselves 3 times on a job like this." "I've been doing it since I was 12, Eli said. Mason looked at him. "Family ranch." There was a beat of silence, not a long one, but the kind with a shape to it, the kind Eli recognized as the moment where the conversation either went somewhere or didn't, depending on what he chose to say next. He could say yes. He could say something vague and redirect the conversation toward the fence, the weather, anything. He had done that 1,000 times. He was very good at it. "Foster family," he said instead. He didn't know why. Different ones over the years. A couple of them had land. He kept his voice flat and even, making it clear that this was a statement of fact and not an invitation to sympathy. Mason was quiet for a moment. He didn't do the thing people sometimes did, which was to immediately apologize or express sorrow in a way that made the other person responsible for managing their feelings about it. He just nodded, slowly, and then said, "That must have been a lot of starting over." Something about the simplicity of it, the way he went directly to the actual experience rather than the socially expected response, made Eli's chest do something unexpected. "Yeah," he said. It was. Is that why you're good at it? Mason asked. And then quickly, as if he wanted to clarify, at adapting, you figured out this place faster than anyone we've ever hired. You already know the horses' names. You know which gate needs the lift. T-Bone told me yesterday you noticed a loose shoe on the bay mare before he did, and he's been watching that horse for 3 years. Eli looked out across the pasture. The light was golden now, the grass turned amber in the late afternoon sun, the cedar throwing long, dark shadows. When you know you can't stay somewhere forever, he said carefully, you pay attention differently. You try to learn everything fast because you might need it later and you might not have much time. Mason was looking at him. Eli could feel it, even though he wasn't looking back. You planning on leaving sundown? Mason asked. His voice was careful too, now matching Eli's register, which Eli noticed and filed away. Not immediately, Eli said. I like it here. Good, Mason said, and there was something in that single word, something quieter and more personal than the context strictly required, that made Eli finally turn and look at him. Mason was already looking away, reaching into the truck for his water bottle. His jaw was set. His expression was neutral. And if there had been something in his voice a moment ago, something that sounded, if Eli was being honest with himself, a great deal like relief, it was gone now, tucked away with the practiced ease of someone who was also, in his own way, good at managing what he showed the world. The drive back to the barn was quiet. The radio played. The cedar trees thinned, and the open pasture spread around them in every direction. The sky above was going pink and orange, and the horses in the far field stood still and dark against it like figures cut from paper. Eli watched the landscape and kept his breathing steady and thought, I am in trouble here. 3 weeks became 5, 5 became 8. Eli settled into Sundown Ranch the way water settles into a landscape, finding the contours, moving around the obstacles, gradually becoming part of the shape of things. He learned the daily rhythms of the place, the sounds it made at different hours, the way the light changed in the east pasture in the morning versus the evening, the personality of each horse, the rotation of the cattle, the unspoken rules of the bunkhouse kitchen regarding who did dishes, when, and who had first claim to the good chair by the window. He and Mason worked together most days, though never exclusively. Mason was the kind of foreman who spread his time across the whole operation, checking in on everything, troubleshooting, making decisions. But there was a pattern emerging that Eli was careful not to read too much into, which was that Mason seemed to find reasons to be wherever Eli was working. Not obviously, not in a way that the other hands seemed to notice. Just present, in the way that some people are drawn toward particular spaces without fully articulating why, the way you return to a certain bench in a park, because the light is right there, even if you can't explain exactly why it matters. They talked more, slowly, carefully. The way two people do when both of them are by nature private, but find themselves trusting the other person against their better judgment. Eli learned that Mason had grown up on this land and never wanted anything else, but that there was also a chapter he didn't often discuss, 2 years studying agricultural management at a university 3 states away, during which he had been, by his own admission, deeply and comprehensively miserable in a way that had nothing to do with the coursework. He had come home at the start of his 3rd year, and his father had been quietly furious, and his mother had been quietly relieved, and Mason had spent 6 months working harder than ever before and not thinking about what it meant that the only place he could breathe was here, on this specific land, under this specific sky. Mason learned that Eli had lived in 11 different homes before he aged out of the foster system at 18, that he had put himself through an agricultural trade certification working nights at a feed store, that he had a complicated, careful relationship with the concept of belonging, not hostile to it, not afraid of it, just deeply skeptical in the way of someone who has been told a place is permanent, and then learned it wasn't, enough times to stop believing in the word. They had these conversations in fragments, the way people who work physically together accumulate an understanding of each other, a sentence while stringing wire, a paragraph over a truck's engine hood, a full exchange sitting on the tailgate at the end of a long day watching the sunset, their boots hanging, their shoulders loose from exhaustion, the specific, comfortable silence of two people who no longer feel the need to fill every moment with words. There was a Thursday evening in Eli's second month, a cool evening, the first real hint of autumn in the air, when they sat on the tailgate of Mason's truck, parked on the limestone ridge overlooking the south pasture, and Mason told Eli about a girl named Sarah who had wanted to marry him 3 years ago, and whom he had loved genuinely and deeply in the way that you can love someone when you are still partly in the process of understanding who you yourself are. And how it hadn't been fair to her, the way he'd ended it, and how he still sometimes wondered if the thing he'd done wrong was leaving or staying as long as he did. Eli listened to all of this with his usual complete, unhurried attention. Then he said, "Were you happy with her?" "I thought I was," Mason said. He was looking at the pasture, not at Eli. "For a while, she made me feel settled, like the question marks were all answered." He paused. "But eventually, I couldn't make myself believe the answers anymore." "What were you really asking?" Eli said. Mason was very quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the cedar behind them. The last of the light was going out of the sky in slow, beautiful stages of orange and pink and purple. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, that high, mournful, oddly beautiful sound that Eli had come to associate with this particular landscape in a way that felt like it was becoming part of him. "I don't know yet," Mason finally said. His voice was low, and he still wasn't looking at Eli, and Eli had the very clear sense that this was both true and not entirely true at the same time. "That's okay," Eli said. "Not knowing yet is allowed." Mason turned to look at him then. The dying light was in his face, and his eyes were warm and dark, and the expression in them was something complicated, something Eli's heart recognized even as his brain issued a strong and firm recommendation to not look at it too closely. "You're easy to talk to," Mason said. "I'm not usually easy to talk to." "I've noticed," Eli said. Mason almost smiled. "Is that a criticism?" "It's an observation." "Is there a difference coming from you?" Eli considered this seriously. "Sometimes," he said. And Mason did smile then, full, unguarded, the kind of smile that rearranged something in Eli's chest against his will, and said, "Fair enough, Eli Carter, fair enough." The horses were Eli's favorite part of the job. He had always had an easier time with animals than people, which he understood was a cliché, but which was nonetheless true. Animals didn't ask you about your past or want you to explain yourself. They responded to how you moved, how you breathed, what you asked of them, and how you asked it. And in return, they were simply what they were, no performance, no subtext, no careful management of what they showed you. Mason's favorite horse was a big gray quarter horse named Smoke, who was opinionated and fast and deeply suspicious of strangers, but who had decided sometime in Eli's first month that Eli was acceptable. This was, according to Mason, an unusual honor. "Smoke doesn't like anyone except me and my mother," he said, the first time he came into the barn to find Eli grooming Smoke and the horse standing completely relaxed, head low, lower lip soft and hanging. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Eli said. "He didn't stop grooming. I just stood next to him for about 20 minutes without asking him for anything." Mason leaned against the barn door and watched this for a moment. "That's it." "That's usually it with animals," Eli said, "and people too, if I'm honest." There was a beat of silence. "Is that what you did with me?" Mason asked. His tone was light, amused, but there was something underneath it. Eli kept his hands moving in steady strokes along Smoke's neck. "I don't know what you mean," he said, which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, and neither of them said so. "Right," Mason said. He sounded like he was smiling. "There is a specific kind of closeness that happens between two people when they have spent enough hours together in physical work, in silence, in conversation, in exhaustion, in the uncomplicated camaraderie of shared purpose. A closeness that builds gradually the way a season builds, so slowly you don't notice it happening until one day the air is different and the light is different and you look at the other person and think, when did this happen? Eli noticed it on a Sunday morning in October. He had been at Sundown Ranch for 10 weeks. The autumn was coming in properly now, the mornings cold and sharp, the light lower and more golden, the cedar and oak turning in patches. He was in the barn alone at first light, as was his habit, doing the morning feed before the others were up, when he heard the barn door open and Mason walked in with 2 mugs of coffee, his breath fogging in the cold air, his hair still slightly rough from sleep, wearing an old flannel shirt that Eli had seen him in a dozen times before. Mason handed him a mug without a word. Eli took it without a word. They stood side by side in the early quiet of the barn, the horses moving softly in their stalls, steam rising from their coffee, and the silence between them was so utterly natural and easy and right that Eli stood in the middle of it and thought, "I'm not going to be able to leave this place." Which was a thought that frightened him, because in his experience, the things that felt like they couldn't be left were the things that eventually left you. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Mason said. It was a Tuesday evening. They were sitting on the floor of the tack room, of all the improbable places for a conversation, doing a sort of combined inventory and repair project that had somehow become a several hours affair involving a great deal of leather conditioner and a running disagreement about the best way to fix a cracked cinch. The single overhead bulb cast warm yellow light. The smell of the room was leather and oil and wood and horses, and it was one of the most comfort-inducing combinations of smells Eli had ever encountered. He looked up from the cinch he was working on. Mason was sitting cross-legged across from him, elbow on his knee, chin in his hand, watching Eli with an expression of easy expectation, as if this kind of question were normal between them, as if there had been no transition point between the conversation about cinch repair and this. "Why?" Eli said. "Because I realized tonight that I know a lot of things about you," Mason said, "but I also know you very well, and I know that what you tell me is never quite everything. There's always a door closed behind the ones you open." Eli looked at him steadily. This was true. This was a perfectly accurate observation, and it made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite locate. "You're the same," he said. "I am," Mason agreed, without any defensiveness. "Which is why I asked you first, instead of offering. I wanted to see if you trusted me enough." "That's a very calculated thing to say." "I'm a very calculated person, underneath all the charm." "The charm is not as thick as you think it is," Eli said. Mason raised his eyebrows. "You see through it." "I see you," Eli said, and then immediately felt the words land in the air between them with a weight he hadn't intended, and looked back down at the cinch. The room was very quiet. The horses moved. A horse somewhere far in the barn made a low, settled sound. "Something I've never told anyone," Eli said carefully, still looking down. "Okay." He kept his hands working on the leather. The work helped him. "When I was 16, I was placed with a family who had a ranch. Real ranch, working cattle, about 400 acres. The man who ran it, the father, he was demanding, hard, but fair, I think, in his own way. I worked harder there than I ever had, and it was the first time in my life that I felt like I was doing something that actually mattered, like I was good at something real." He paused, and the pause held a lot. "I thought they were going to adopt me. The social worker mentioned it. The mother had mentioned it. I let myself believe it for about 3 months, which was the longest I had ever let myself believe anything." He stopped. He could feel Mason watching him, and he kept his eyes on the cinch. "What happened?" Mason asked. Quiet, no pressure. "They moved," Eli said. "The man's business failed and they lost the ranch and they moved to a city in another state. They couldn't take me, that's all." He said the last 2 words with a very deliberate flatness that was the verbal equivalent of closing a door. "So I went back into the system, and 6 months later I aged out, and that was the end of it." The silence after this was different from the earlier silence. It had a texture to it. "I'm sorry," Mason said, and he said it in the way Eli wished people would always say it, not with sorrow in his voice that made Eli responsible for soothing it, but with a directness that acknowledged what had been said and let it stand in the room. "It's all right," Eli said, and then stopped himself because that was the automatic response, the smooth, flat stone he always reached for. "No," he corrected himself, "it wasn't all right. It was genuinely terrible, but I survived it and it's a long time ago." "It's why you don't let yourself believe in permanence," Mason said. Eli looked up at him. I didn't say that. You didn't have to, Mason said. They looked at each other, and the eye contact went on slightly longer than the situation required, and Eli was aware of a warmth moving through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Your turn, Eli said. Mason looked at him for another moment, considering, deciding. Then he shifted and set down the bridle he'd been working on and said, when I was at university, there was a man in my agriculture cohort named Daniel. We were close friends for almost a year, and I spent most of that year being aware, in a way I couldn't quite look at directly, that what I felt for him was not what most people mean when they say friendship. He said this without looking away, which Eli recognized as an act of quiet courage. What happened? Eli asked. Nothing, Mason said. I let it not be anything. I came home instead. He held Eli's gaze. I spent the next 3 years telling myself that the reason I came home was because I missed the land, and that is also true, but it isn't the only truth. The room was quiet. The horses breathed. The warm bulb above them cast its amber light. That took courage to say, Eli said finally. It doesn't feel like courage, Mason said. It feels like the first honest thing I've said about it out loud. That's what courage feels like, Eli said. Something moved across Mason's face, something uncertain and wondering and a little undone. And he looked at Eli with an expression that Eli had no name for, except that it was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen on another human face, and it landed in the center of his chest like something that had been falling for a long time and finally arrived. Neither of them said anything else for a long time. They went back to the leather. Their hands were steady, the horses were calm, and outside the tack room, the night moved around the ranch in its enormous, unhurried way, as it always had and as it always would. His name was Garrett. He arrived on a Friday morning in late October, a friend of Mason's from the university years, apparently, who had driven out to visit for a long weekend. He was tall and blonde and easy in the manner of people who have always been considered attractive and have had enough time to make peace with it. He had a bright, wide smile and an immediate comfort with Mason that manifested in clapped backs and casual physical familiarity, shoulder grips, easy contact, the language of people who have a long shared history. Eli watched this from across the yard when Garrett's car pulled in, and he recognized with a cold, clear clarity the feeling that went through him as the feeling that had been quietly growing inside him for 10 weeks, finally showing itself fully now that there was something to react to. It was jealousy. He might as well call it by its name. He didn't think it was fair. He didn't particularly want to be feeling it. He pushed it firmly to the back of his mind and went back to what he was doing, which was repairing a section of the corral fence, and he was entirely professional and composed when Mason brought Garrett over to introduce him an hour later. This is Eli Carter, our newest hand, best fence worker I've had in years. Mason said this with a warmth and ease that did nothing to help the situation. Garrett shook his hand with that broad smile. Mason talks about you, says you've been a real asset. Glad to hear it, Eli said, steady and neutral. You should join us for dinner tonight, Garrett said. We're going into town. Mason's taking me to that barbecue place he's been going on about. Eli glanced at Mason, who looked, was it possible, slightly caught out. Sure, Eli said, maybe. He didn't go. He said he was tired, which was partially true, and he sat in the bunkhouse that evening reading a library book about sustainable grazing techniques, with the focused dedication of a man trying very hard not to think about where someone else is and who they're with and whether they're laughing. Garrett stayed 4 days. During those 4 days, Eli was impeccably professional. He worked. He was polite at meals. He answered questions when Garrett asked them. He was, by any external measure, completely fine. Internally, he was engaged in a very old and deeply familiar project, which was the project of taking a feeling, examining it with clear eyes, deciding it was inconvenient and potentially dangerous, and constructing around it a wall of composed self-discipline that he had been building and rebuilding since he was about 9 years old. The wall was very good. He had a lot of practice. It held. What it couldn't hold was the night of the second day, when he was walking back from the south barn late, and he passed the fire pit at the side of the main house where Mason and Garrett were sitting, and he heard them talking in the low, quiet way of people who have been friends for a long time. He wasn't trying to hear them. He was just passing. But then he heard his own name, and he stopped, in the shadow of the cedar tree, not meaning to eavesdrop, but not moving away either. "He's not what I expected," Garrett was saying. "What did you expect?" Mason's voice. "I don't know, based on how you'd been describing him, I thought he'd be more." A pause. "He's very quiet." "He's the most present person I've ever met," Mason said. No hesitation in it, no qualification, just the statement, delivered with the certainty of something he had thought about. A pause, then Garrett, "Mason." A longer pause. "Don't," Mason said, quietly but with weight. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying, Garrett." "Does he know?" The longest pause yet. Eli stood very still in the shadow of the cedar. The fire crackled. A horse shifted in the barn. The sky above was enormous and salted with stars. "No," Mason said. "Are you going to tell him?" "I don't know yet." "You've been here for years, and never." "I know," Mason said, and the edge in his voice was gentle but absolute. "I know. Can we not do this tonight?" A beat, then Garrett's voice, lower and kinder. "You look happy, though. I haven't seen you look like that in a long time." Mason didn't answer this, or if he did, it was something too quiet for Eli to hear. Eli walked back to the bunkhouse with his hands in his pockets and his heart doing something complicated and terrifying and slightly wonderful in the cage of his chest. And he lay in his bunk in the dark for a long time, looking at the ceiling, and he thought, what do I do with this? Garrett left on Sunday afternoon. Monday morning, Eli showed up to work as usual, was assigned a fencing job on the north pasture, and spent the day doing it alone. This was normal. He often worked alone on tasks that didn't require extra hands. There was nothing unusual about it. Except that Mason didn't come by, and Tuesday Mason was occupied with a veterinarian's visit, and Wednesday Mason spent most of the day in the house dealing with some paperwork issue related to the fall cattle sale. And by Thursday, Eli had registered with a quiet, resigned clarity that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, but Mason was not distant exactly, just careful. Where he had been easy and present before, there was now a slight hesitation, a formality that hadn't been there. Their conversations were about work. The morning coffee in the barn had happened twice last week. This week it hadn't happened at all. Mason's eyes, when they met Eli's, still had warmth in them, but the warmth now came with a kind of guard behind it. Eli recognized this behavior because he had performed it himself 1,000 times. It was what a person did when they had gotten too close to something and had decided, for reasons of self-protection, to back up. He should have found it reassuring in a way. If Mason was pulling back, it meant the situation was being managed, contained, directed away from the edge it had been approaching. Eli had been doing the same thing internally. This was the rational, reasonable, self-protective response. No one would get hurt. Everything would remain professional. He would keep his job and his place on this ranch he had quietly and deeply grown to love. He should have found it reassuring. He didn't. He found it unbearable. And he was angry at himself for finding it unbearable, because he was 22 years old, and he was not new to loss, and he knew how to handle things that hurt, which was to put your head down and work, and keep your walls solid and remember that the world did not owe you what you wanted, and you had survived harder things than this. He had survived 11 homes and 100 goodbyes and 3 years of starting over, and he could survive a friendship cooling. It was fine. He was fine. He was not fine. It was Rooster who noticed first. Rooster was 20 years old and had the uncanny social perception that some young people possess before they learn to pretend they don't notice things. He sat down across from Eli at breakfast on a Thursday in the second week of this new, careful distance, pushed a plate of eggs toward him, and said, without preamble or softening, "You and Mason have a fight." "No," Eli said. "You seem like you have." "We didn't." "Okay." Rooster ate his eggs. Something's different, though. Everything's fine, Eli said. Rooster looked at him with the directness of someone who has not yet acquired the social training that tells you to leave things alone. You haven't smiled in a week, he said. Eli looked up from his plate. I'm just saying, Rooster said, shrugging. You smiled a lot before. It was a nice thing. The whole place felt different when you and Mason were talking by the barn and you'd laugh at something. Now you two walk past each other like you're trying to be invisible. He took another forkful of eggs. None of my business, just saying it's noticeable. Eli didn't say anything. He ate his breakfast, but something Rooster had said lodged in him and stayed there. The whole place felt different. He thought about that for the rest of the morning. He thought about whether that was possible, whether two people occupying the same space and being easy with each other could genuinely alter the feeling of a place. He decided it was, because he had been on ranches where people were in conflict and the air was different, heavier, and he had been on ranches where people were content and the air was different there too, lighter, more generous. The land reflected the people on it. He had always believed that. He thought about what it meant that the absence of something between two people could make a good place feel lesser. He thought about this, and then he went back to his fencing, and he did not arrive at any conclusions that were useful. It rained on a Saturday night in November. Not just rain, the kind of storm that announces itself hours before it arrives, the pressure dropping, the cattle restless, the dogs skittish, the air going electric and charged. By mid-afternoon, the sky to the southwest was the color of a bruise. By 4 o'clock, the first lightning had cracked the horizon. By 6, it was on them. 3 of the horses had been left in the east pasture and needed to be brought in before the storm peaked. Mason gathered the available hands, which was Eli, since Cliff and T-Bone were already dealing with an issue at the south barn and Rooster had been sent into town that afternoon. So it was the two of them, in rain gear, on horseback, riding hard into a darkening evening, while the lightning threw white light across the hills and the thunder followed close behind. They worked fast. Mason knew the horses, knew the land. Eli followed his lead and matched his pace. The first horse came easily. She was a young mare, nervous but responsive, and Eli got her turned toward the barn without trouble. The second was harder, a big gelding that had been spooked badly by the lightning and was running the fence line, head high, eyes white. Mason peeled off to cut him off while Eli held the mare and the third horse steady. The rain came in full when they were still 200 yards from the barn. It hit like a curtain dropped from the sky, instant and total, soaking through everything in seconds. The lightning was overhead now, the thunder simultaneous, the world contracting to a radius of about 20 feet in every direction. Eli could barely see Mason. He could track him by movement and sound, the gelding's hoofbeats, Mason's voice, low and steady, talking the horse down. And then the gelding shied hard at a lightning strike, went sideways, and Mason's horse went with it. And in the flash of light, Eli saw Mason lose his stirrup and pitch sideways in the saddle. He didn't fall. He corrected, fast and fluid, the kind of balance that lives in muscle memory. But it was close, and Eli's heart had gone to his throat in the half-second before he corrected, and the feeling that went through him in that half-second was not the feeling you have for a coworker. He got the 3 horses to the barn. Mason got the gelding in, right behind him. They closed the doors and stood in the sudden relative quiet of the barn while the storm hammered the roof, and the horses moved and settled in their stalls. They were both soaked through. The rain gear had helped, but not much. The rain had found every gap, and water ran off the brims of their hats and dripped from their sleeves and puddled on the barn floor around their boots. The lightning outside made the light in the barn go white and strange at intervals, and in those intervals Eli could see Mason's face very clearly. He was looking at Eli. "You all right?" Mason said. "Fine," Eli said. "You?" "I'm fine, a beat. That was close on the gelding." "I saw." Another beat. They were standing fairly close together in the barn aisle. The horses had taken up the available space, and there wasn't much room. Eli could see the water running down Mason's jaw. He could see his chest rising and falling, still quick from the exertion and the adrenaline of the near fall. The storm was loud around them, and the barn was warm and close, and smelled like horses and wet rain gear, and something electric from the storm, and something in the air between them felt, in this moment, precisely as charged as the sky outside. Eli, Mason said. Yeah, Eli said, which was not an answer to anything, but was the most honest sound he could make in that moment. Mason's jaw worked. He took one breath. He reached up and took his hat off and held it in both hands, and the gesture was so nakedly uncertain, so unlike him, so devoid of the usual easy composure, that it almost undid Eli entirely. I've been distant, Mason said. This past week, I know you've noticed. I noticed, Eli said. I'm sorry for that. You don't have to apologize for it, Eli said carefully. I understand. Do you? Mason looked at him, and his eyes were very dark and very direct, and there was nothing carefully managed in them right now. What do you understand? Eli held his gaze. The lightning lit the barn in white and was gone. The thunder rolled. The horses breathed. I understand that you're being careful, Eli said, and I understand why. Why? Mason asked. The word was quiet. Because whatever this is, Eli said, gesturing at the space between them with a movement of his hand that was small but total in its meaning, it's complicated, and you're someone who takes the complicated things seriously. Mason stared at him, and then, slowly, something in his face changed, some final piece of held-back honesty giving way. Like a door that has been held closed, finally swinging open on its own weight. I pulled back because I got scared, Mason said, because Garrett came and saw whatever he saw and said something to me that I wasn't ready to hear, and my response was to put space between us because I'm good at that. It's what I do, it's what I've always done. He paused. But the problem is that when I put space between us, the space doesn't feel empty. It feels like something is missing. The thunder rolled overhead, long and rolling and deep. Eli's heart was doing something loud in his chest. What is it? Eli said very quietly. That feels like it's missing. Mason looked at him for a long, suspended moment in the warm amber light of the storm-enclosed barn. You, he said, simply, without decoration. It feels like you are missing. The storm pressed down on the barn. Eli stood in the amber light and the warmth and the smell of horses and rain, and Mason Holt was looking at him with the most completely honest expression he had ever seen on another face, and Eli felt something shift inside him, a long-held defense, a carefully maintained distance, like ground moving after a season of rain. I'm right here, Eli said. And he meant it in every sense of the word. They didn't kiss that night. I want to be clear about that, because the moment might make it seem like the kind of story where they would, where the storm and the barn and the charged air would converge into one cinematic inevitable moment. But Eli was not that person. He did not move on the strength of charged air alone. And Mason, for all his warmth and his sudden honesty, was a man who had spent years not saying the true thing, and saying it was not the same as knowing what to do next. What happened was that they stood in the barn while the storm peaked and passed, and they talked, for a long time, more honestly than either of them had talked to anyone in years, possibly ever. Mason told him about Daniel, not just the outline he'd given in the tack room, but the actual shape of it, the specific weight of it, the way it had crystallized something about himself that he had spent the following 3 years trying to manage rather than simply accept. Eli told him about being afraid of permanence, not as a fact, not as a reported characteristic of himself delivered in a flat tone, but as an actual fear, the texture of it, what it felt like to stand in a place and love it, and simultaneously be preparing internally for the loss of it, the way a person might love something beautiful and fragile with a clenched hand rather than an open one. Do you do that here? Mason asked. On this ranch? Eli was quiet. Yes, he said, but it's getting harder. Why? Eli met his eyes. Because this place is harder to hold at a distance. The ranch. The ranch too, Eli said. Mason was still. The storm had pulled back now, the rain softer, the thunder more distant, moving east. The barn was warm and quiet, and the horses had settled completely. The whole world outside had been washed clean and was dripping in the dark. I don't want you to have to hold this at a distance, Mason said. Not the ranch, Not, he stopped, started again. I want you to belong here, Eli. I want you to feel like you can stay. That's not something you can give someone, Eli said gently. A feeling of belonging, it's not a thing you hand to a person. I know, Mason said. I'm not trying to give it to you. I'm trying to say, he exhaled, slow and frustrated with his own words. I'm saying that whatever you're afraid of losing here, I don't want to be one of the things you're afraid of losing. I want to be one of the reasons you stay. The silence after this was enormous and tender, and neither of them knew quite what to do with it. That's a big thing to say, Eli said. I know, Mason said. Are you sure you mean it? I've been thinking it for 8 weeks, Mason said. I'm fairly sure. Eli looked at his hands, then back at Mason's face. I'm not easy, he said. I don't know how to do any of this easily. I don't know how to just open my hand and let good things be good without preparing for when they stop being good. I've tried to and I can't. It's just how I'm built. I know, Mason said, and then after a pause, I've been watching how you are, Eli, for 8 weeks. The way you work, the way you listen, the way you don't say the easy thing when the hard thing is more honest, the way you sat with Smoke for 20 minutes without asking him for anything and earned his trust in a way I've never seen anyone else manage. He paused. I'm not asking you to open your hand all at once. I'm just asking you to know that I see you. That when you're in this space, my space, this place I love more than anywhere on earth, everything is better. Everything is more itself. Eli was quiet for a long time. The last of the rain drummed softly on the barn roof. I see you too, he said finally. I've been seeing you since the morning I met you, which was a terrible time to start because you made a bad joke and I was embarrassed, and I was not in any way prepared to feel anything about anyone. Mason almost smiled, the trespasser joke. I am never going to let that go, Eli said. And Mason did smile then, full and warm, and Eli let himself feel how much he had missed seeing that over the past 2 weeks, and he thought, maybe this is what it feels like to let something be real. They did not rush. That was the thing about them, the quality that defined whatever it was they were becoming. Both of them had spent too long protecting themselves to be reckless now, and both of them, underneath the walls and the carefulness, were people who understood that good things required patience. So they moved slowly, carefully, like two people relearning a language they had always known but never spoken aloud. The morning coffee in the barn resumed. The long conversations resumed. The easy, wordless rhythm of working together resumed, but with a new quality to it, a new awareness, a warmth that was no longer being carefully managed away. There were changes, small ones. Mason's hand on Eli's shoulder when he passed behind him in the barn, a brief contact that lasted perhaps a second longer than pure practicality required. Eli handing Mason his coffee in the morning, and their fingers overlapping on the mug for a moment that both of them noticed and neither of them mentioned. Their shoulders touching when they sat on the tailgate of the truck at the end of long days, the contact easy and natural and not moved away from. The almost moments, the eye contact that lasted past the point where it was merely functional, the sentences that began one way and ended another, because the true ending was not yet something either of them could quite reach. The times when they were close enough, in the barn, on the fence line, sitting on the limestone ridge at sunset, that Eli was acutely aware of the distance between them as a specific, measured thing, and of his own strong and inconvenient desire to close it. They were moving toward something, slowly, with the careful momentum of a season turning. November deepened and the cattle sale came. 3 days of organized chaos, trucks arriving, paperwork, the loading of cattle, the noise and dust and activity that filled the whole ranch from before dawn until after dark. Eli worked harder than he ever had, and he was good at all of it, the logistics of it, the cattle handling, the way he could anticipate where a problem was developing and position himself to prevent it before it happened. Mason watched him across the dusty, busy yard on the second day of the sale, and felt a specific kind of pride that was not exactly his to feel, but which he felt anyway, helplessly, watching Eli move through the work like it was something he had always been meant to do. At the end of the second day, after the trucks had left and the dust had settled, and the hands were eating a late dinner that Dottie had laid out in the main house kitchen, a rare treat, the big house table set for everyone, Mason sat beside Eli, and his father, Robert Holt, sat across from them, a tall, weathered man in his 60s with Mason's dark eyes and a direct, assessing manner that had softened somewhat with age. Robert Holt watched Eli eat for a moment and then said, "You're Eli Carter." "Yes, sir," Eli said. "My son tells me you're the best fence man he's ever seen." "He's generous," Eli said. "He's accurate," Robert said, and something in his tone made it clear that he was not a man who delivered compliments that weren't strictly accurate. He looked at Eli for a moment with those dark, assessing eyes. "You planning to stay on?" Eli met his gaze. "If you'll have me," he said. Robert nodded, a slow, definitive movement. "Mason," he said, not looking away from Eli, "make sure this man's contract is fair." "Already done, Dad," Mason said, and the warmth in his voice when he said it made Eli feel something warm and specific that settled in his chest like light. The night after the sale, when everyone else had gone to bed and the ranch was quiet and the sky was brilliant with cold November stars, Eli sat outside on the bench by the south barn. He wasn't expecting company. He was simply sitting in the dark and the cold and the star-washed quiet, the way he sometimes did when he needed to hear himself think. Mason came out of the main house and saw him and crossed the yard without hesitating. He sat down beside Eli on the bench. Their arms touched. Neither of them moved away. "Good couple of days," Mason said. "Really good," Eli said. "Your father, he's formidable." "He is. He loves this place." "Deeply," Mason said. "It was his father's before it was his. He was born in that house." A pause. "When I was at university and I knew I was going to come home, I called him from a payphone at 2 in the morning. I didn't have a cell, long story, and I told him I was coming back. He didn't say much, but I could hear him breathing on the other end, and I knew." Mason looked up at the stars. "I knew I was making the right choice." "You belong here," Eli said. "I do," Mason said simply. Then, quietly, "I want you to feel that way too. I keep thinking about what you said, about holding things at a distance because you're afraid of losing them. And I want," he stopped, turned to look at Eli. "I want you to feel like this place could keep you safe, that it won't just let you go." Eli looked at him. In the starlight, Mason's face was quiet and serious, and so stripped of all its usual easy composure that Eli felt the force of it like something physical, like standing close to a source of warmth and feeling your whole body reorganize toward it. "I'm starting to," Eli said. His voice was very quiet. "Feel safe here. I'm starting to let myself." Mason reached out in the dark and found Eli's hand where it rested on his knee. He covered it with his own, a still, certain pressure. Eli looked down at their hands and then back up at Mason's face. "Okay," Mason said. "Yeah," Eli said. His heart was going like a caught bird. "Yes." They sat like that for a long time, in the cold and the dark and the star-brilliant silence, their shoulders against each other and their hands warm together, and the night moved around them, and the ranch breathed, and somewhere in the field a horse moved in the dark, and it was the most content Eli Carter had felt in as long as he could remember, possibly ever. It was, of all things, a phone call that set it off. 3 weeks after the cattle sale, 3 weeks of that slow, careful warmth building between them like a season, finally finding its proper temperature. Eli came back from a long day's work on the north boundary to find Mason standing by the main house in a conversation on his phone that involved a name Eli had heard before, Daniel. He didn't mean to stop. He stopped anyway. He couldn't hear the words. He caught the name once clearly, and then the shape of Mason's posture, turned slightly away, one hand in his hair, the particular set of his shoulders that Eli had learned to read over weeks, and his tone, which was warm in a way that sounded intimate. Eli walked past to the bunkhouse. He put his tools away. He showered. He ate dinner with Cliff and T-Bone, who were having a slow debate about the merits of various fence post materials, and he contributed 1 or 2 sentences to this and then excused himself early. He lay in his bunk in the dark, and he did the thing he had promised himself not to do anymore, which was to begin constructing his exit. Not consciously, not as a decision, But the machinery of it, the internal inventory of what he owned, the mental accounting of how much he'd saved, the quiet assessment of which ranches in the region might be hiring, this machinery that had always been running underneath everything that he had spent 11 years maintaining, began to turn again, quietly, automatically, like a habit so deep it lives below the level of thought. He told himself, "You see, this is why you don't let yourself believe." He told himself, "You knew." He fell asleep, rehearsing a resignation that he hadn't decided to give. He was cold to Mason the next day. He didn't intend to be. He intended to be his usual self, measured, professional, composed. But his usual self was constructed on a foundation that, over the previous 8 weeks, had significantly shifted, and without that foundation, what came out of him was not warmth or even neutral professionalism. What came out of him was withdrawal, the closing of the doors. Mason noticed by mid-morning. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything about Eli always, with that attentiveness that had once made Eli feel genuinely seen and now, in this new and frightened context, felt almost unfair in its acuity. By afternoon, he had pulled Eli aside into the smaller barn, away from the others. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing," Eli said. "Eli, I'm fine, I'm just tired." "You've been tired every day for 2 months, and it's never looked like this." Mason's voice was careful but direct. "Something changed overnight. Talk to me." Eli looked at the barn wall behind Mason's shoulder. "I heard you on the phone yesterday with Daniel." A pause. "Oh," Mason said. "You don't owe me anything," Eli said immediately, the words coming out in the careful, composed tone he used when he was trying not to show what was underneath. "We haven't said anything, we haven't defined, there's nothing formal between us. I'm aware of that, so you don't owe me an explanation." "Eli," Mason said. "I'm just saying." "Eli, stop." His voice was quiet and firm. "Look at me." Eli looked at him. "Daniel called me because he is engaged," Mason said. "He called because he and I have been in loose contact for years, and he wanted to tell me before I heard it from someone else. He's engaged to a man named Patrick who, from what he tells me, is a school teacher and coaches youth soccer, and is apparently, according to Daniel, the kindest person he has ever met." Eli was very still. "I was happy for him," Mason continued, "genuinely, because Daniel and I there was never anything between us except what I kept to myself, and he was my friend, and I am glad that he is happy." He stepped forward 1 step, closing the space between them slightly. "And the moment I hung up the phone, I thought, I need to tell Eli about this, because he would want to know, and because I tell Eli things, and because," he stopped. "Then, because you are the person I want to tell things to." The barn was quiet. Eli's chest ached with something that was not sadness. "I jumped to a conclusion," Eli said. "You did," Mason said, not unkindly. I started making an exit plan," Eli admitted, and the admission cost him something real. Automatically, without deciding to, the machinery started up. Mason's expression changed. The careful firmness softened into something else entirely. "Oh, Eli," he said. "It's a bad habit," Eli said. "It's a survival mechanism," Mason said, "and I understand it." He reached out and put his hand on Eli's forearm, a firm, warm pressure. "But I need you to hear something." "Okay," Eli said. "I'm not one of the things in your life that is going to suddenly leave," Mason said. He said it quietly, with an intensity that was not dramatic but was complete. "I'm not going to tell you that a place is permanent and then let it not be. I'm not the man from the ranch when you were 16. I'm not going to make you believe in something and then take it away from you." A pause. "I understand why you're afraid of that. I understand why your first response to uncertainty is to start building your exit. But I am genuinely asking you to let me be different from the things that have hurt you." Eli looked at him for a long time. The barn light fell warm and amber between them. Outside, somewhere, one of the border collies was barking at something in the afternoon, and the sound was familiar and domestic and reassuringly ordinary. "That's a lot to ask," Eli said, and his voice was not flat this time. It was bare. "I know it is," Mason said. I'm asking it anyway. Another long moment. Eli looked at Mason's hand on his arm. He thought about 11 homes and 100 goodbyes and the boy he had been at 16 who had let himself believe. He thought about what it meant to be brave. Not the brave of physical courage, he had that, he had always had that, but the other kind, the kind that costs more. I'm trying, Eli said. I'm genuinely trying. That's all I'm asking for, Mason said. December arrived and brought the first cold front that deserved the name. The mornings were sharp and brilliant, the grass silver with frost. The cedars dark green against a pale sky, the breath of the horses rising in clouds. The ranch hunkered down into its winter rhythms, shorter days, longer evenings, more time in the barns, the particular intimacy of people thrown together by cold and work, and the necessary closeness of shared labor in a place that does not stop for weather. Eli and Mason worked. They talked. They sat on the tailgate and on the bench and at the big kitchen table when Dottie invited the whole crew for dinner, which she did more often now as the days shortened. They laughed more than Eli had laughed in years, more than he had thought he was capable of, at specific and private things that required no explanation because the context was them, was this ranch, was the particular language of two people who had been paying close attention to each other. And the distance between them, that specific measured thing that Eli had spent weeks being acutely aware of, was slowly closing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but closing. The first time they were genuinely, undeniably close, standing in the barn in the early dark of a December morning, Eli trying to diagnose a persistent cough in one of the younger horses, Mason holding a lamp to give him better light. The two of them bent together over the horse's neck. Mason turned to say something and Eli was already turning toward him, and they were suddenly very close, faces a hand's width apart, Mason's breath warm and real in the cold air. Neither of them moved. The horse breathed between them. The lamp swung gently in Mason's hand and the light moved across his face. His eyes were dark and steady, and there was an expression in them that Eli had no more words left to avoid namming. Eli, Mason said, just his name. I know, Eli said. And he closed the remaining distance. It was brief, tentative and careful and very gentle, the kind of first contact that asks a question rather than taking anything. Eli's heart was enormous in his chest. Mason's hand came up to Eli's jaw, the touch as light as possible, a barely there warmth. They pulled back by mutual, wordless consent, looked at each other in the lamplight. The horse coughed. It was such a perfectly timed, absurdly ordinary sound that Eli started to laugh, a real laugh, helpless and disbelieving, and Mason laughed too, the sound breaking out of him like something held for a long time, and they stood there in the barn in the December cold and laughed until they had to lean on the horse's shoulder for support, and the horse turned and looked at them with the profound, unimpressed patience of a horse who has been through a lot. Good timing, Mason managed. She's always been dramatic, Eli said. I'll check her tomorrow, Mason said, when the light is better. And when there are fewer distractions, Eli said. Mason looked at him with a warmth that was wide open and entirely unguarded. I'll add that to the calendar, he said. They did not shout it from any rooftop. They did not announce it to the crew or to Robert Holt or to anyone else. They were both private people, and the ranch was a working environment, and they approached what was growing between them with the same care and deliberateness they applied to everything else. But there were changes that the people around them noticed, even if they couldn't have named exactly what had changed. Cliff noticed that Mason laughed more, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. T-Bone noticed that Eli, who had always been good but always somehow a step apart, watchful rather than joined, had started walking through the yard with a slightly different quality to his stride, like a man who has decided he is not visiting but living. Rooster noticed that when Eli and Mason stood next to each other, neither of them stood facing slightly away, the way people do when they are keeping a part of themselves in reserve. Dottie, who had been running the main house kitchen for 15 years and who possessed the clear-eyed perspective of a woman who had watched several generations of people come through a single place and had learned to read them the way some people read weather, told Robert Holt one morning over coffee that she was glad to see his son looking the way he looked. Robert Holt looked at her over his cup. "What way is that?" he said. "Like himself," Dottie said. Robert was quiet for a moment. "The Carter boy," he said. "I didn't say anything," Dottie said, and put 2 eggs on his plate. Robert looked out the kitchen window at the yard, where Eli and Mason were walking toward the barn together in the early morning, their breath fogging, shoulders close. He watched them for a moment with the expression of a man confirming something he had already half understood. "Good man," Robert said, which was as much as Robert Holt ever needed to say about anything that mattered. There was an evening in the deep of December when a pipe froze and burst in the bunkhouse, and Dottie insisted that Eli stay in the main house while it was repaired, and Mason showed him the guest room, the one at the end of the hall, the one with the view of the south pasture, and they stood in the doorway of it together in the quiet house. "This was my room when I was a kid," Mason said, "before my parents gave me the bigger one. I used to climb out the window and sit on the porch roof and watch the horses in the field at night." "Did you get caught?" Eli asked. "Every time," Mason said. "My father didn't say much about it. My mother pretended to be angry, but I could always tell she wasn't." Eli looked around the room. The bed had a quilt on it, old and hand-sewn, the kind that accumulates a history of use, washed many times, edges soft, the pattern faded but still beautiful. The window looked out into the dark, and he could see the south pasture, the horses just visible in the moonlight. "I'll be fine here," Eli said. "I know," Mason said. He didn't move away from the doorway immediately. He stood there for a moment, and in the low light of the hallway behind him, Eli could see the quietness in his face, the genuine, unguarded piece of him. "I'm glad you're here, Eli, in this house, on this ranch." A pause. "In general, I'm glad you exist and that you drove 300 miles and ended up on my fence post." Eli felt the warmth of this move through him from somewhere that was deeper than his skin. "I cried on your fence post," he said. "I know, I thought about that for weeks." "What did you think?" "I thought whoever that person is, they feel things very deeply and they're trying very hard not to show it. And I thought, I understand that." He met Eli's eyes. "And then I went and got you coffee." "That was the right thing to do," Eli said. "I have occasional moments of competence," Mason said. Eli smiled, small, real, the kind that reached his eyes and that he once would have guarded more carefully. "Good night, Mason." "Good night, Eli," Mason said, and went back down the hall, and Eli stood in the borrowed room of the man who had become. He allowed himself to think it fully, no hedging, no reservation, the most important person in his life, and he looked out at the horses in the moonlit field, and he thought, "I'm not afraid of this place. I'm not bracing for the loss of this. I am here, and it is real, and I am letting it be real." He put his hand against the cold glass of the window and looked out at the wide, silver-dark pasture of Sundown Ranch, and he felt it, for the first time in his life, with both hands open and nothing held back. He felt that he belonged somewhere. It snowed on a Thursday in early January. It didn't happen often in this part of West Texas, maybe once or twice in a winter, a light dusting that usually melted by afternoon. But this was a proper snow, starting at midnight and still coming at dawn, covering the ranch in a silence that was almost supernatural, making everything familiar into something beautiful and strange. Eli stood at the barn door in the early morning and watched it come down and felt something he could not quite name, except that it was close to happiness and slightly larger than anything he had a word for. Mason appeared beside him, as he had appeared beside him on so many mornings, and they stood in the barn door watching the snow settle over the pastures and the cedar and the fence lines and the distant hills. "It looks like a different place," Eli said. "It's the same place," Mason said. "Same in every way, just lit differently." Eli looked at him. Mason was watching the snow, his breath making slow clouds in the cold air, and there was something on his face, a thoughtfulness, a stillness, that Eli wanted to stay near, that he had been staying near deliberately and gratefully for months now, that he no longer questioned the wanting to stay near. "Mason," he said. Mason turned to look at him. I don't have a plan for leaving, Eli said. I don't have an exit strategy. I don't have a timeline. I stopped building one. Mason looked at him steadily, waiting. I want to be here, Eli said. I want this to be the place, the actual permanent this is where I stay place. He paused, and the words came from somewhere very deep and very real. I want that to include you. I want you to be part of what I'm staying for. Not the whole thing, I know that's not, I know it's more complicated than that, but part of it. He held Mason's gaze, which was the bravest thing he could remember doing. Is that something you want too? Mason reached out and put his hands on Eli's face. His palms were warm despite the cold, and real and certain, and Eli felt himself lean into them like a plant turning toward light. Yeah, Mason said, that is very much something I want. He pulled Eli in, slowly and deliberately, and when Eli closed his eyes, he felt the snow coming down around them and the warmth of the barn behind them and the solid, real, present aliveness of this man who had gotten up early every morning for months and brought him coffee because he'd noticed he was always already up. And Eli Carter, who had spent 22 years learning to hold things with a clenched hand, opened his hands finally and let it be good. Spring came to Sundown Ranch the way it always did. Gradually, then suddenly, the cedar going dusty green at the tips, the creek running high from the February rains, the cattle restless with the new season's energy, the horses fat and glossy from the winter hay. Eli had been at Sundown Ranch for 8 months. His room in the bunkhouse had a calendar on the wall and a handful of library books on the windowsill and a pair of boots under the bed that had been resoled twice since he arrived and still had years left in them. His saddle was in the tack room between Cliff's and Mason's. His name was on the contract and on the crew list, and in the way that matters more than either of those things, in the muscle memory of everyone on the ranch. The way they called for him when something needed doing, the way T-Bone had started occasionally asking his opinion on the cattle rotations, the way Rooster had developed a habit of saving him the best cut of Dottie's cornbread without being asked. He had stopped looking for the exit. He had stopped mapping the distances to other jobs, other towns, other fresh starts. He had not made any dramatic declarations about it. It had simply, gradually, ceased to be something he did, like a habit finally worn away by disuse. On a Tuesday morning in March, he and Mason rode the east boundary together, a long loop that took most of the day checking fence line and knotting the conditions of the spring pasture. The weather was perfect, cool and clear, the light sharp and generous, the hills green from the winter rains. They rode at a pace that was comfortable for the horses and for the conversation, which ranged across the day's work, and a book Eli was reading, and a plan Mason was developing for a new hay storage structure, and a conversation Eli had had with his case worker from years ago who had called, out of nowhere, simply to check in. That's remarkable, Mason said when Eli described the call, after all this time. She said she still thinks about the kids she couldn't do more for, Eli said. She said she wanted to know how I was. He paused. I told her I was good. Are you? Mason asked. His tone was easy, warm. Eli considered the question with his usual thoroughness, the way he always considered questions that deserved a real answer. He looked out across the spring pasture, green and brilliant, the cedar dark along the ridge, the limestone outcroppings catching the morning light. He felt the horse moving under him and the sun on his face, and the easy, certain presence of Mason riding beside him. Yeah, he said, I really am. Mason smiled, looking forward between his horse's ears, and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. They came back to the barn in the late afternoon and unsaddled the horses side by side in the companionable silence of people who have done the same task together enough times that the coordination is automatic. Gerald the donkey watched them from his doorway with the profound, ancient dignity he brought to all observations. Eli reached out as he passed and scratched Gerald between the ears, which Gerald permitted with an air of gracious condescension. He lets you do that, Mason said. He won't even let my father come within 3 feet of him. We have an understanding, Eli said. What kind of understanding? I don't ask anything of him, Eli said, and he doesn't bite me. That sounds like a partnership. It is, Eli said. He looked at Gerald, who was already looking away with the air of a creature whose time is valuable and who has better things to attend to than gratitude. It took about 2 months before he let me get close enough to touch him. Every day I just came and stood nearby, didn't push, just was there. Mason was leaning on the barn door, watching him. "Sound familiar?" he said. Eli looked over his shoulder at him. "Somewhat," he said. "You're saying I'm like a 20-year-old arthritic donkey." "I'm saying you both needed someone to stand nearby without pushing," Eli said, "and that in both cases it was worth the patience." Mason laughed, that real, unguarded laugh that Eli had come to love, with the same uncomplicated certainty with which he loved the sound of the creek in the morning and the smell of cedar on a hot day and the sight of this particular stretch of hill country in the spring. "I can work with that," Mason said. "I know," Eli said. There was a moment, late on a Friday night in April, when the whole ranch was dark and quiet, and Eli sat on the south porch of the main house where Mason had, sometime around January, started inviting him in the evenings when the day was done and the hands had gone to bed. The night was soft and warm, the first real warmth of spring, and the sky above was open in every direction. Mason sat beside him, and they had been talking about nothing in particular. The spring cattle schedule, a piece Mason was reading about water rights law, a song that had been in Eli's head all day for reasons he couldn't explain, and then they were quiet, the way they often were, a silence that had no edge to it, that needed no filling. Eli looked at the stars. He thought about the fact that in 2 months he would have been on this ranch for a year. He thought about the version of himself that had arrived on a September night, put everything he owned in a cardboard box and a duffel bag, and cried alone on a fence post in the pre-dawn dark. He thought about all the things that had happened since then, the accumulation of them, the specific and irreplaceable weight of a year lived fully in a place that had become, with patient and genuine thoroughness, home. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Always," Mason said. "That morning I arrived," Eli said, "when I was on the fence post, I wasn't just crying about the job I'd lost. I was crying because I was exhausted, because I had been starting over for so long that I couldn't remember what it felt like to just arrive, to arrive somewhere and know that you didn't have to leave. I was crying because I didn't believe that was something I was going to get." He paused. "And then you came out of the barn with coffee and said something terrible, and I thought, this man is impossible. And also I thought, I want to be where he is." Mason was very still. "I didn't understand it at the time," Eli said. "I didn't have a name for it. But looking back, even on that first morning, even when I didn't know you at all, I think some part of me recognized something. I think that's why it scared me so much when I started to care about you. Because I knew some early, not quite conscious part of me knew that this was different from all the other places, that this was the real one." Mason turned to look at him. His face, in the soft spring dark, was entirely open. "You scare me too, you know," Mason said quietly. "You have since day one, because I'm not someone who lets people in easily, and you were inside before I'd made the decision to let you." "The 20 minutes without asking strategy," Eli said. "I should have known it worked both ways," Mason said. They sat with this for a moment, the specific, serious, warm weight of two people acknowledging something large. "I love this place," Eli said. "I love this ranch. And I love," he stopped, and the word sat at the edge of his breath, large and real and slightly terrifying and exactly true. Mason waited. He did not rush him. He had never once rushed him. "I love you," Eli said. He said it quietly and directly, and with his full face, nothing held back, both hands open. I'm not saying it to start anything or to demand anything back. I'm saying it because it's true, and it's been true for a long time, and I'm done holding things with a clenched hand." The silence that followed was the most alive silence he had ever sat in. "Eli Carter," Mason said, and his voice had a quality in it that Eli had never heard before, a fullness, an undone quality, like something that had been held for a long time finally given room. "I have been in love with you since I watched you scratch the ears of my mother's horse, and the horse leaned into you like you were the safest thing in the world." Eli closed his eyes for one moment, just one, then he opened them. "When was that?" he said. "Third week you were here," Mason said. "I didn't know." "You did know," Mason said gently. "You were just being careful." "I was always being careful," Eli said. "I know," Mason said, "and now?" Eli looked at him. At this man, this specific and irreplaceable man, this particular combination of easy warmth and hidden depth, of rough work and tender attentiveness, of all the qualities that Eli had spent months cataloging with the careful attention of someone who does not trust easily, and for whom the cataloging was itself a form of love. "Now I'm choosing not to be," Eli said. Mason leaned over and rested his forehead against Eli's, and Eli felt his breath and his warmth and the solid, real, present fact of him, and he put his hand against the side of Mason's face, and the night moved around them, vast and quiet and full of stars. Epilogue: Sundown. 6 months later, Eli Carter's name was added to the Sundown Ranch payroll under the title of Senior Hand and Assistant Foreman. Robert Holt had suggested it. Mason had agreed, and then said, with the practiced neutrality of a man not trying to betray anything, that he would let Eli decide if the title worked for him. Eli had said yes, and then had gone back out to the fence line before anyone could see the expression on his face, which was the expression of a man who has just been handed something he has been reaching for in the dark for a very long time and has finally, unmistakably, found. Dottie baked a pie to mark the occasion. T-Bone said, "Took long enough," which was his version of a standing ovation. Rooster said, "Called it," and produced from somewhere a crumpled piece of paper on which he had apparently written the date of Eli's arrival and the note, "This one stays." He presented this with the satisfied air of a man vindicating a long-held position. Cliff said nothing, but he moved Eli's saddle to the hook on the right side of the tack room, which was the hook closest to the door, the one he'd been using for years. When Eli noticed and gave him a questioning look, Cliff shrugged and said, "Better position, easier to reach," and then went back to what he was doing. Gerald the donkey continued to hold his post at the barn door, utterly unmoved by the ceremony of it all, as ancient and intransigent as the limestone beneath the grass. But on a morning in late autumn, when Eli walked past him with his coffee and his hat, and the long, easy stride of a man going to work on a piece of land that is entirely his to care for, Gerald turned his head and watched him go. Which, for Gerald, was basically a declaration of love. On the last Sunday of October, Eli and Mason rode to the top of the limestone ridge at sunset, Smoke and Eli's sorrel mare side by side, their horses blowing in the cool air, the whole of Sundown Ranch spread below them in every direction. The light was the deep, resonant gold of late autumn, the cedar throwing long shadows, the cattle small and dark in the far pasture, the stone house standing solid and warm with its lit windows, the barns casting their familiar shapes, everything exactly as it had been and exactly better. Eli sat on his horse on the limestone ridge and looked at all of it, at this specific and irreplaceable piece of the world, and he felt the fullness of it, the completeness of it, the fact of it, not bracing, not measuring the distance to the exit, not holding anything with a clenched hand. Beside him, Mason sat on Smoke and was quiet, and the wind moved through the cedar below, and the last of the light went down in slow, gorgeous stages of orange and rose and deep, trembling purple, and the first stars appeared above the hills. "Thank you," Eli said. Mason looked at him. "For what?" Eli was quiet for a moment. He looked at the stars and the last of the light and the land. "For coming out of the barn that morning," he said, "for bringing the coffee, for not looking away." He paused, "for waiting." Mason reached across and gripped his arm, a brief, certain pressure. "I'd wait 1,000 mornings," he said, without any performance in it, just as a statement of fact. Eli looked at him. The stars were coming out now, the sky deepening to its true dark, the ridge alive with the sound of cedar and wind, and the far-off calling of something wild in the hills below. "You won't have to," Eli said. And the night came in around them, and the stars opened across the enormous Texas sky, and Sundown Ranch lay below in its deep and ancient quiet, and two men sat on a limestone ridge above it all and were exactly, completely, undeniably home. The end.
If this story made you feel something, if you found yourself holding your breath during the storm or smiling during the fence repair, or leaning forward when Eli finally said the words he would been holding for months, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. Please hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. Leave a like if Eli and Mason found their way into your heart. And in the comments, tell me which moment hit you hardest. Was it the first morning with the coffee, the storm in the barn, the night of the porch? I read every single comment. Tell me yours. Thanks for watching and keep watching. And one more thing, Mason's father knows more than he ever said out loud. Doty definitely heard that porch conversation. And there is a man named Daniel who is engaged to a school teacher and who in a few months is going to come to Sundown Ranch for a visit with his fiancee. Thanks for watching and keep watching.